Ora koutou katoa. My name is Dr. Rob Coated. I'm the Chief Medical Officer for Immigration New Zealand. And firstly, I'd like to thank Karen Chung and the Refugee Health Liaison team for their presentation, and also for Pingi Telefoni's presentation just prior to mine. So as a bit of background, this session is a clinical session for panel physicians, and it specifically relates to visa applicants who present to you that have disabilities. The aim of the session is to provide the panel physician with the knowledge to examine New Zealand applicants and also what information we require at Immigration New Zealand. The types of disabilities that will be discussed in this session include visual impairment, hearing impairment, physical impairment, cognitive impairment, and intellectual impairment, and also a bit of a definition around what those terms mean. We'll also cover our OARS educational support services, and these services and funding are available for individuals with disabilities, and I'll also discuss a little bit around the cost associated with these and why they're considered a high cost. Also during the session, we will have 5 questions for you. Here they are all collated into one slide. And basically I'll read them out now for you so that you have a chance to think about them as they pop up. So question number 1, a person with monocular vision can work as a taxi driver in New Zealand without any special authorization. Question 2, severe 71 to 90 decibel hearing loss or profound sensory neural hearing loss in one ear should be referred to an auditory specialist for assessment. Is that true or false? A person with a past history of traumatic below-knee amputation who is fully independent would not usually require extra information in the immigration medical examination. And is that true or false? A person with significant cognitive impairment would also be intellectually impaired. Is that true or false? A medical assessor has to assess the cost of all special education requirements for a child in order to assess the child as having an acceptable standard of health. True or false? And these questions will come up separately throughout this presentation. So let's start with visual impairment. And when reviewing someone with visual impairment, it's important to understand what we require in New Zealand. And it's also important to note that usually if somebody has an impairment in just one eye, in fact, even if they're blind in one eye, they would generally have an acceptable standard of health unless their intended occupation is dependent on having binocular vision. So with visual impairment, some careers require you to pass certain standards of vision. For example, to have a passenger endorsement or a heavy vehicle endorsement on your driver's license, you will need to achieve 6/9, which is 20/30, either with or without visual correction. Individuals with monocular vision are generally considered unfit to drive, and that's drive commercially, for instance, taxi, bus, or heavy-duty vehicles. And the New Zealand Transport Agency may allow some exceptions with a supporting letter from either an optometrist or an ophthalmologist. And there are other careers such as pilots, commercial and non-commercial, police officers, members of our defence force, and seafarers, which are people who work in the maritime industry. And these people all have special requirements to meet. And they have to pass specific or certain standards in visual acuity, and that's usually measured with the Snellen visual acuity chart, include colour vision as well, and peripheral vision testing. And I refer you to the New Zealand Vision Standards for Occupation, and I've got a link on this slide there for you. In New Zealand, if your corrected vision is 6/24 or less, or your peripheral vision is significantly reduced to less than 20 degrees, you are eligible to access the services of the Blind Low Vision New Zealand, and that was formerly called the Blind Foundation in New Zealand. The term legally blind can refer to someone whose vision with correction, glasses or contact lenses, is worse than 6/60, which is 20/200, or if their peripheral vision is significantly reduced. So question 1, A person with monocular vision can work as a taxi driver in New Zealand without any special authorisation. And I'll give you a few seconds to ponder that question and reflect on it. Okay, moving on. On the left of that slide there, you see a picture of the Snellen visual acuity chart, and underlined there in green. Underlined there in green is 6/6, which is measured in meters, 20/20, which is usually a visual acuity measurement you might see, for instance, in the US, and that's based in feet. And 6/9 there is underlined in red, and that's one of the standard allowable measurements for visual impairment. And on the right there, we have a cartoon regarding a bee getting his visual acuity tested, and I found that rather amusing. So visual acuity with or without correction, these are what you'll find in our INZ panel physician instructions to you, and that's you can find those on eMedical. And under D7, the visual acuity of each eye must be tested separately and with corrective lenses if they are worn. You use the Snellen's Snellen's chart, or E or similar charts must be used. If a refractive defect is suspected, pinhole testing must be done. Corrected visual acuity must be recorded. In children who are too young to use a chart, a comment must be made on whether vision appears normal or not. And a referral to an ophthalmologist is necessary where you might have severe visual impairment, where you've got visual acuity of 660 or beyond, after best possible correction at country of origin. Where there's apparent severe visual loss, where you've got chronic eye infections, or if you think there's any condition likely to significantly affect the applicant's ability to function at home, study, or work, or perform activities of daily living. In eMedical, if visual acuity is less than 6/18 in the best eye, or a child's vision is recorded as abnormal, eMedical will auto B-grade the IME. And in the instructions, the INZ 1216 at D17, there's also an inclusion for fundoscopy. Now, I know that Australia have actually taken that out as a mandatory test. And for our New Zealand panel, I'd like to stress that this isn't mandatory. You should only really perform this if you're confident and experienced at fundoscopy examination. And the examination of the eye should also include physical inspection of the eye, eyelids, and eye motility as well. So moving on to hearing impairment, and there's a diagram there of someone who has a cochlear implant. The assessment of hearing should include the following: either grossly, or if your clinic has an audiogram, you can use that as a test. Each ear must be tested separately, and in young children, a comment must be made on whether hearing appears normal or not. And please put down any abnormality that you discover. And what do our panel physicians, the INZ 1216, what does that outline for hearing? So referral to an appropriate specialist physician is necessary for severe 71 to 90 decibel hearing loss or profound bilateral sensory neural hearing loss after best possible correction. Cochlear implants, if no recent letter from a specialist is available, or if you've got very little information on cochlear implants, we'd expect you to refer to a specialist physician. If there's apparent significant deafness, if there's congenital or genetic hearing impairment, or any condition likely to significantly affect the applicant's ability to function at home, study, or work, or perform activities of daily living. So brings us up to question 2. So question 2, severe 71 to 90 decibel hearing loss or profound sensory neural hearing loss in one ear should be referred to an auditory specialist for assessment. Is that true or false? And I'll give you a few minutes, a few seconds to actually think about that question. Okay, moving on to physical impairment. For residency applications, medical assessors need to consider the Immigration New Zealand listed conditions. And these include, for physical impairment, severe, chronic or progressive neurological disorders, which include paraplegia and quadriplegia. So they are actually listed in our instructions as being deemed to be high-cost conditions and not acceptable standards of health. Another one there is severe developmental disorders where significant support is required, and that includes physical disability. What INZ is not too concerned about, if somebody has a physical impairment, say they've lost a finger or they've lost even a limb, but they've got near normal function, we wouldn't be too concerned about if they can actually live relatively normally. So what information around physical impairment do we require from the panel physician? For significant physical disabilities, including quadriplegia, a neurologist or occupational therapist, or a GP report on the current level of function, current support services needed, and the long-term prognosis of the condition. Information on supporting services the person requires, including carer support, an aids to daily living assessment, school reports if the person is school-aged, and if there's any planned intervention or surgery planned. We'd like to have as much information on that as possible. So when people are being assessed for physical impairment in New Zealand, there's a consideration for full-time care based on their physical disability-related needs. And this can be broken down into requiring full-time care in a rest home placement, community, residential placement, and private hospital placement. So the things that would be considered in what we call a needs assessment would be somebody who requires an aid to mobilise, or they're a high falls risk, requires supervision to mobilise, requires supervision to transfer, and that could escalate up to the point where they need a hoist to transfer. If they're incontinent, and there's an inability to manage continence products or interventions, if they've got impaired communication, if they require full assist with all personal cares, if they require repositioning for skin integrity, if they require overnight supports for nightly turns, or if they require medication oversight. So question 3. A person with a past history of a traumatic below-knee amputation who is fully independent would not usually require extra information in the immigration medical examination. Is that true or false? And I'll give you a few seconds to ponder that one. Okay, moving on to intellectual and cognitive impairment. So when we talk about intellectual and cognitive impairment, we also need to know, is there a difference or what the difference is? So basically, cognitive impairments are obstacles to learning. An individual with a cognitive impairment may experience difficulty in cognition, resulting in a difficulty perceiving, recognizing, or understanding the world. And this may also result in an inability to focus for a significant period of time. And autism spectrum disorder or severe attention deficit hyperactivity disorder are examples of cognitive impairments, and they have a range of severity from mild to severe. And it's worth noting that a child with an high IQ, for example, may still have a severe cognitive impairment. Whereas intellectual impairments are specific cognitive difficulties that create a low intelligent or IQ score. And in New Zealand, we have an act that actually defines what a low IQ score is for an intellectual disability, and we'll go into that shortly. Question 4. A person with significant cognitive impairment would also be intellectually impaired. Is that true or false? So intellectual impairment has 4 classifications: mild, moderate, severe, and profound, based on IQ range. And it's important to note that regardless of the classifications, all four of these are regarded as significant intellectual impairment. So individuals with Down syndrome, for example, have an average IQ of 50, and it usually ranges between 30 and 70. So this would be in the mild to moderate range of intellectual disability, but this is still classified as that person having a significant intellectual impairment. We also have the term, which you've probably heard of before, which is developmental delay, which is usually related to children when it's probably a little bit, when they're too young or it's too difficult to determine what their IQ is, for instance, to actually determine what level of intellectual impairment they may have. So developmental delay is defined as any significant lag in a child's physical, cognitive, emotional, or social maturity. Intellectual disability is characterized by broad impairment in cognitive and adaptive functioning, typically with an IQ of less than 70, and that's diagnosed before the age of 18. A global developmental delay diagnosis often precedes a diagnosis of intellectual disability, as cognitive skill or IQ cannot be reliably assessed before the age of 6. So I mentioned before that New Zealand has an act. It's called the New Zealand Compulsory Care and Rehabilitation Act 2003, and that specifies that an IQ of 70 or less as being a significant intellectual impairment. And a person has an intellectual disability if that person has a permanent impairment that, one, results in a significantly sub-average general intelligence and results in significant deficits in adaptive functioning. And this is measured by tests generally used by clinicians. And the next slide outlines a number of the skills that are tested. And to have a intellectual impairment or intellectual disability, at least 2 of these skills listed in the next slide have to be tested and shown to be significant. And it's also important to note that an assessment of a person's general intelligence is indicative of significantly sub-average general intelligence if it results in an IQ that is expressed as 70 or less. So these are the skills that are tested, and you need at least 2 of these to be tested for intellectual impairment, and they include communication, self-care, home living, social skills, use of community services, self-direction, health and safety, reading, writing and arithmetic, and leisure and work. And the developmental period of a person generally is completed when the person turns 18. So what does it say in our INZ 1216 panel physician instructions? At D23, are there any physical or mental conditions which may prevent this person from attending a mainstream school, gaining full employment, or living independently now or in the future? And this is the main question that we want the panel physicians to answer. So you need to consider any condition or finding that has current or likely future impact on the applicant's capacity for independent living and or employment, and provide the full details for us. And this assessment should include the following: eating, drinking, dressing, washing, toileting, bladder and bowel control, mobility and locomotion, communication, comprehension and expression, social cognition, social interaction, memory, and the need for devices, aids or assistance, and all abnormalities must be noted. And it's a continuation of the question. A 903, which is an activities of daily living, needs to be completed for any applicant where there is concern about their ability to carry out their ADLs, and that includes the frail elderly. And it's worth noting, eMedical will generate a request for an ADL assessment if the panel physician responds yes to the question. If an ADL assessment is not appropriate, for instance, if you've got a young child, or baby, for instance, please finalise the section and eMedical is incomplete. and include an explanation as to why this wasn't completed. For instance, the person was too young to actually assess properly for the ADL. Referral to an appropriate physician is necessary for any condition likely to significantly affect the applicant's ability to function at home, study or work or perform ADLs. And e-medical will auto B grade if the panel has answered yes to that question at D23. When we talked about physical impairment, we talked about the requirement of full-time care, and the same goes for a needs assessment when assessing somebody if they require full-time care in New Zealand for intellectual and cognitive impairment. And this needs assessment is based on whether there's been a history of community-based supports that have failed, challenging behaviours, an example is property damage or self-harm, safety issues, inability to safely remove themselves from a safety concern, e.g. can't remove themselves from a fire. If the family is unable to provide prolonged supports in the home, if there's carer burnout, carer stress, if an intellectual disability diagnosis has been made that has also concurrent medical related needs, and somebody might have a seizure condition on top of their intellectual disability, for example. Clients who show high levels of naivety or are easily led or influenced by others and therefore are a safety risk. Family history of abuse or neglect. If they're unable to complete personal cares of home management tasks without community supports and health would be compromised long term, or if the person has a dual disability. So moving on to our ongoing resourcing scheme, or ORS. In order for a medical assessor to determine whether an individual has an acceptable standard of health or not, to meet our New Zealand health requirements, the medical assessor has to consider one specific high-cost educational requirement, and that's the ongoing resourcing scheme. So what is ORS? It's a special education subsidy, if you like, or funding for specific disabilities for children. It is an annual amount for a school to assist children with disabilities in order for them to attend and participate in school as a normal child would. The age eligibility is between 5 and 21. There's a very high threshold to be eligible for this funding. And there's an amount which is usually around up to $20,000 per annum for the whole span of years from 5 to 21 that this is available for that child. Plus, there is additional funding specifically for that child if there's any other needs to be met. For instance, if there's any structural changes necessary at the school, so if that child requires a ramp, if the school needs to be fenced, or if elevators need to be installed, that is all separate to that $20,000, and that extra funding is available. And as an extreme example, if you put all that together, the total funding available could potentially get up to $90,000 per annum. So in our immigration instructions, and I won't go out into this in a huge amount of detail, in our immigration instructions, though, it's very much spelled out in terms of what the ongoing resource scheme is. And basically, this slide just outlines that if a medical assessor has received information from the Ministry of Education that an applicant, a visa applicant, is likely to be eligible for our ORS funding, then that person doesn't have an acceptable standard of health. So this leads us on to question 5. A medical assessor has to assess the cost of all special education requirements for a child in order to assess the child as having an acceptable standard of health. Is that true or false? So we can move on to the answers for those questions for you. So I'll go over those briefly. So question 1, a person with monocular vision can work as a taxi driver without any special authorization. That is false. As we presented here today, taxi drivers, bus drivers, heavy vehicle operators need an exemption in order for them to actually do that work. Question 2, severe hearing loss or profound sensory neural hearing loss in one ear should be referred to an auditory specialist for assessment. That is false. The clue there was, the question said one ear, and it's actually bilateral. That is the reason when you need to actually refer to a specialist. Question 3, a person with a past history of a traumatic below-knee amputation who is fully independent would not usually require extra information in the immigration medical examination. That is true. If they're fully functional, we would accept that. Question 4, a person with significant cognitive impairment would also be intellectually impaired, and that's false. I gave the example there of a child with an extremely high IQ may still have a severe cognitive impairment. So one doesn't necessarily follow the other. Question 5, a medical assessor has to assess the cost of all special education requirements for a child in order to assess the child as having an acceptable standard of health. And that's false as well. A medical assessor only needs to consider OARS funding eligibility. That brings us to the end of our 3 sessions. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and I hope you got something out of the 3 sessions. So thank you again. Ngā mihi.